I never thought I'd become the kind of person who could steal hundreds of thousands of dollars without ever holding a weapon, breaking a lock, or threatening anyone. The strange thing is that it didn't even feel like a crime when it started. It began with a sentence my former boss used to repeat during budget meetings. "A fictitious project is a budget without results." Everyone laughed whenever he said it. He treated it like a joke. A cynical observation about how corporations wasted money. At the time, I laughed too. 3 years later, that sentence became the foundation of the biggest crime I ever committed. Back then I was a project coordinator at a mid-sized consulting firm. The company handled technology modernization contracts for private clients and local government agencies. My job was boring: spreadsheets, reports, timelines, invoices, and endless meetings where people pretended to understand what was happening. What I understood better than anyone was the budget system. Most people looked at project budgets as numbers. I looked at them as stories. Every project had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every expense needed a justification. Every delay needed an explanation. As long as the story made sense, nobody questioned the numbers. The company was growing fast, and management was overwhelmed. Departments rarely communicated. Accounting trusted project managers. Project managers trusted finance. Finance trusted documentation. And I controlled a surprising amount of that documentation. At first I noticed small discrepancies. Thousands of dollars allocated to software licenses that were never used. Equipment purchases that somehow disappeared from inventories. Training sessions that never happened. Nobody cared. Nobody checked. That realization stayed in my head for months. I wasn't struggling financially, but I wasn't doing well either. My father had medical bills. My apartment rent kept increasing. My savings account looked pathetic despite years of work. Meanwhile, executives received bonuses larger than my annual salary. I told myself I wasn't jealous. But I was. The thought arrived gradually. What if a project existed only on paper? Not completely fake. That would be obvious. Just vague enough to survive scrutiny. An internal initiative. A pilot program. A research effort. Something difficult to measure. Something that could consume money without producing visible results. I remember sitting alone in my apartment one rainy Thursday night, staring at budget reports on my laptop. That was the moment the idea stopped being a fantasy. For the first time, I seriously considered creating a project that didn't exist. Not because I needed to. Because I believed I could. And that realization scared me far less than it should have. After that rainy Thursday, I spent weeks convincing myself not to do it. Every time I opened a budget report, though, I saw the same thing: gaps. Nobody was actively looking for fraud because everyone assumed someone else was. The system wasn't secured by oversight, it was secured by trust. That's when I started planning. I knew a completely fake project would eventually attract attention, so I designed something intentionally boring. I called it the Operational Process Efficiency Review. The title was perfect because nobody could explain exactly what it meant, yet everyone agreed it sounded important. I created timelines, draft objectives, and preliminary research notes. Nothing extraordinary, just enough paperwork to make the project appear real. I studied old internal initiatives and copied their structure. Every document referenced another document, creating a chain of legitimacy. The more I prepared, the more confident I became. At night, however, confidence turned into anxiety. I wasn't stealing anything yet. Technically, I was only creating paperwork. But deep down I knew the paperwork wasn't the crime. It was the beginning of one. The next phase was making sure the project looked alive. A proposal sitting in a folder wouldn't be enough. Real projects generated activity, and activity generated credibility. I began carefully adding references to the initiative and meeting notes. Nothing major, just brief mentions that could easily be overlooked. If someone searched for the project later, they'd find traces of it scattered across different documents. I also built a budget that seemed reasonable. That was important. Greed destroys scams faster than audits do. Instead of requesting a huge amount, I proposed a modest allocation spread across several expense categories. Small numbers attracted less attention. The hardest part was maintaining consistency. Every date, every report, every projected milestone had to match. One contradiction could trigger questions I didn't want answered. A few coworkers actually complimented the proposal. One manager called it proactive planning. Hearing that gave me an unexpected rush. People weren't just accepting the fiction, they were helping validate it. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether it would work. I started wondering how far I could take it. The project existed on paper, but it still needed something far more important: official approval. Without that, all my preparation would remain a stack of documents nobody cared about. I submitted the proposal during a period when management was overwhelmed with larger contracts. That timing wasn't accidental. I had watched the company long enough to know when executives skimmed reports instead of reading them. The waiting was unbearable. Every email notification made my stomach tighten. I kept imagining someone noticing a flaw, calling me into a conference room, and asking questions I couldn't answer. Instead, the opposite happened. A director sent back a short response thanking me for the initiative and approving the preliminary budget. That was it. No meeting. No detailed review. No challenge. Months of planning had passed through the system in less than a minute. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something closer to shock. The barrier I'd feared most had disappeared almost effortlessly. The project was now officially recognized by the company. It had a budget code, a schedule, and management support. And for the first time, my fictional project became real enough to spend money. Approval changed everything. Up until that point, I could still tell myself I was conducting an experiment. A stupid one maybe, but an experiment nonetheless. Once the budget was approved, that excuse disappeared. The next step would involve actual money. I spent several days staring at spreadsheets, looking for reasons to stop. Instead, I kept refining the plan. I created expense requests tied to research materials, software evaluations, and outside consulting support. Each request was small enough to appear routine. The first transfer was the hardest. When I submitted the paperwork, my hands were shaking. I remember rereading every line at least 10 times before clicking send. The amount wasn't large, but it represented a point of no return. If the request went through, I would no longer be preparing a fraud. I would be committing one. A week later, the expense was approved without a single question. Nobody called. Nobody investigated. Nobody even seemed interested. The realization hit me harder than I expected. The system I had spent months studying wasn't resisting me at all. It was quietly helping me move forward, one approved transaction at a time. Over the next few weeks, the project developed a rhythm. Every few days, I submitted another routine expense. Each one was supported by documentation I had prepared in advance. The amounts were deliberately unremarkable. Large transactions attract attention. Ordinary ones disappear into the background. What surprised me most was how quickly people accepted the project as part of the company. Managers referenced it in meetings. Team members forwarded me questions about its progress. A few even suggested ideas for future phases. That should have worried me. Instead, it made me bolder. The project had become something bigger than a fake budget line. It now existed in other people's minds. They assumed it was real because everyone else assumed it was real. Then an unexpected problem appeared. A department supervisor emailed me asking for a status update and preliminary findings. It was a perfectly reasonable request, exactly the kind of request I should have expected from the beginning. I spent the entire evening staring at the message. For months, I'd been focused on creating the illusion. Now I had to maintain it. And maintaining a lie is always harder than telling one. That email haunted me for days. A status report sounds simple until you remember there was no actual project behind it. No research. No findings. No progress. Just carefully organized fiction. If I ignored the request, I'd attract attention. If I answered carelessly, I could expose everything. I decided to do what many struggling projects do: produce a report full of vague language. I spent an entire weekend writing it. The document was packed with phrases like ongoing evaluation, cross-departmental assessment, and preliminary efficiency indicators. It looked professional while saying almost nothing. To make it more convincing, I included charts based on harmless internal statistics that weren't directly related to the project. When I finally sent it, I barely slept. The supervisor responded the next afternoon. He thanked me. That was all. No questions. No requests for clarification. No follow-up meeting. For a few moments, I felt invincible. The report had worked. But that feeling quickly turned into something darker. Every successful deception increased the stakes. The project was gaining credibility, and credibility meant expectations. The more people believed the story, the harder it would be to escape it. After the status report was accepted, my confidence grew faster than my judgment. The project had survived scrutiny, however limited it had been. Instead of seeing that as a warning, I treated it as proof that my plan was working. Looking back, that was the moment greed began replacing caution. I expanded the budget gradually. Nothing dramatic. A few additional software evaluations. More research expenses. A small increase in consulting costs. Each request had supporting documents attached, and each document looked consistent with everything that came before. The money wasn't flowing directly into my pocket in obvious ways. I had spent months creating layers between myself and the transactions. On paper, everything appeared legitimate. What I didn't anticipate was the attention success attracts. One senior manager mentioned my project during a company-wide meeting. He praised it as an example of forward-thinking and efficient planning. Hearing dozens of employees applaud something that didn't actually exist made my chest tighten. Everyone around me seemed impressed. I felt sick. For the first time, the fraud was no longer hidden in spreadsheets and reports. It had become part of the company's public narrative, and I was standing at the center of it. The applause from that meeting should have been my signal to stop. Instead, I convinced myself that ending the project suddenly would raise more suspicion than continuing it. It was a convenient excuse, and I accepted it because it allowed me to keep going. A few weeks later, the first serious complication arrived. An employee from the internal audit team contacted me. The message was polite and routine. He explained that several ongoing initiatives were being reviewed and requested supporting documentation for selected expenses. My heart dropped. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything else. Every worst-case scenario ran through my head. I imagined investigators reviewing transactions, discovering inconsistencies, and tracing everything back to me. That night, I gathered every file I had created since the beginning of the scheme. The collection was enormous. Reports, meeting notes, approval emails, budget forecasts, and status updates filled entire folders. Ironically, the fraud looked more organized than many legitimate projects. Still, one mistake could destroy everything. As I prepared the documents for review, I realized a terrifying truth. I no longer feared being caught someday. I feared being caught tomorrow. The audit review stretched over nearly 2 weeks, and they were easily the longest 2 weeks of my life. Every morning, I checked my email before I even got out of bed. Every notification made my pulse jump. I kept expecting a message requesting a meeting with senior management, legal representatives, or someone from compliance. Instead, the auditor asked for clarification on small details. That was somehow worse. Specific questions forced me to think carefully about every answer. A vague explanation might seem suspicious. Too much detail could create contradictions later. I spent hours comparing old reports with new responses, making sure dates, names, and expenses matched perfectly. The stress started affecting my sleep. I became irritable and distracted. Coworkers noticed and asked if I was doing okay. I blamed deadlines and workload. Then, one Friday afternoon, the auditor sent a final email. The review was complete. No major concerns had been identified. I stared at the screen for several minutes, unable to process what I was reading. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something closer to disbelief. The closest examination of the project had ended, and somehow the lie had survived. Surviving the audit should have been the end. Instead, it became the beginning of a different problem. For months, I had been operating under pressure. Fear kept me alert. Every decision felt important because discovery seemed possible. Once the audit passed, that pressure vanished almost overnight. What replaced it was guilt. Not dramatic, movie-style guilt. Nothing that sent me running to confess. It was quieter than that. Persistent. Annoying. The kind that follows you into ordinary moments. I noticed it during conversations with coworkers. People trusted me. Some even respected me because of the project's apparent success. Whenever someone complimented my work, I felt a knot form in my stomach. At home, I started avoiding discussions about my job with friends and family. They saw a professional advancing in his career. I saw a fraud being rewarded. The strangest part was that nobody suspected anything. There were no investigations, no rumors, no accusations. I had spent so long fearing exposure that I wasn't prepared for the possibility of success. And success, I discovered, came with its own punishment. I had to live with what I knew. For nearly a year, everything remained stable. The project continued to exist, expenses continued to be approved, and nobody seriously questioned its value. I began to believe the danger had passed. That belief led to the single biggest mistake I made during the entire scheme. I became careless. Not dramatically careless, just enough to matter. While preparing a quarterly update, I reused information from an older report and forgot to correct one of the projected completion dates. The contradiction was small, but it was there. A milestone that had supposedly been achieved months earlier suddenly appeared as an upcoming objective. Most people would have ignored it. One manager didn't. He replied with a simple question asking which timeline was correct. The message itself wasn't threatening, but it triggered immediate panic. I spent hours trying to explain the discrepancy as a reporting error caused by revised planning assumptions. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. For the first time, someone had noticed a crack. The issue was eventually accepted and forgotten. At least by everyone else. I couldn't forget it. It proved something I had been avoiding for years. The lie wasn't flawless. It was fragile. After that timeline mistake, I started seeing risks everywhere. Every report looked suspicious to me. Every email felt loaded with hidden meaning. When managers asked ordinary questions, I immediately wondered whether they knew something. Rationally, I understood most of it was paranoia, but fear doesn't care much about logic. The project had become too large to manage comfortably. Years of fabricated progress, revised objectives, and budget adjustments had created a complicated web of documentation. Maintaining consistency required constant effort. Then another problem emerged. A company restructuring was announced. Departments would be merged, budgets reviewed, and several long-running initiatives re-evaluated. My project was scheduled for a strategic assessment by a newly formed management team. That news hit me harder than the audit. Auditors reviewed paperwork. New managers wanted results. Real, measurable results. The fictional project had survived because it existed in a bureaucratic environment where process often mattered more than outcomes. The restructuring threatened that balance. Suddenly people wanted evidence that resources had produced value. Something I couldn't provide. For the first time since creating the project, I seriously considered confessing. Not because I had become noble. Because I was running out of places to hide. The strategic assessment meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I barely slept the night before. By then, I had accepted a simple reality: no presentation, report, or explanation could produce years of missing results. The project's greatest weakness had always been hidden in plain sight. It consumed resources, generated paperwork, and held meetings, but it never delivered anything substantial. The new management team wasn't hostile. In fact, they were professional and surprisingly patient. That made the situation even worse. They asked straightforward questions. What measurable improvements had been achieved? Which recommendations had been implemented? How had operational efficiency changed? I answered as carefully as I could, relying on generalities and old talking points. The room grew noticeably quieter with every response. Then one manager requested supporting evidence for several claims made in previous reports. I knew the game was over. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Nobody accused me of fraud during the meeting. But the questions kept coming, and my answers kept weakening. Within weeks, a deeper review was launched. For years, I'd been building a structure made of paper. Now people were finally testing whether it could support weight. The deeper review uncovered everything. Not overnight, but piece by piece. Investigators compared reports, budgets, approvals, and supporting documents. The more they examined the project, the more obvious the pattern became. What had survived years of casual oversight couldn't survive concentrated attention. I was eventually confronted with the evidence. At that point, denying it would have been absurd. I admitted my role and cooperated fully. The consequences were severe. I lost my job, my professional reputation, and relationships with people who had trusted me. Some were angry. Others were simply disappointed. Oddly enough, the disappointment hurt more. What changed me most wasn't getting caught. It was realizing how easily I had justified each step along the way. The fraud didn't begin with a massive theft. It began with a small compromise, followed by another, and another, until the person making those decisions no longer resembled the person who started. If there's any lesson here, it's this: never confuse opportunity with permission. Systems can fail. Oversight can fail. But eventually, reality demands results. And when it does, every fiction comes due.